Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and it's great to have you with me here for another discussion of military history. This one will be a little bit of a change of pace from the last few episodes, as we will not be dealing with ships and naval actions. Instead, we're going to look at an aspect of the Spanish Civil War ground combat. This war was the first major conflict in which many of the weapons of mechanized warfare were used since their employment in embryonic form in the First World War. One of the best examples of this is the use of tanks and other armored vehicles by the warring faction. Though Spain itself produced little in the way of armor, the foreign backers of both Franco's rebels and the forces fighting in the name of the Second Republic would send significant numbers of their latest models to fight on the country's battlefields. Here they would face combat for the first time, putting the theories of their design and tactical employment to the test. For this one, I'll be working primarily from the book Spanish Civil War Tanks, The Proving Ground for Blitzkrieg by Stephen J. Zaloga. For general background, I'll be relying as always on Anthony Beevor's classic general history, The Spanish Civil War. So, with that out of the way, let's go back to the relatively calm decade of the 1920s. Here in Morocco, fighting against the stubborn and highly motivated Rif insurgency, in the classic tank country of North Africa, the first Spanish armored forces take the field. In early 1922, the Spanish army purchased a total of 18 World War I surplus tanks from the French. These were a dozen Renault FTs and 6 Schneider CA-1s. These two models illustrate the two tracks pursued in the development of armored fighting vehicles during the course of the war. The Schneiders were the kind of thing that perhaps most people think of when imagining a Great War tank, basically a large armored box on treads, with a blunt, boat-like prow designed to push down and flatten barbed wire entanglements. The Schneiders had no turret. Its main armament was a 75mm short-barreled gun and a sponson mount on the right-hand side, along with a pair of Hotchkiss 8mm machine guns. Spanish designation for these vehicles was Carro de Asalto Schneider M16. They had a 6-man crew and were protected by spaced layers of armor 11mm and 5mm thick. This was decent protection against machine gun fire and small arms as well as shell fragments, but little use against anything heavier. The 14-ton vehicle was powered by a 4-cylinder engine developing only 60 horsepower, so it was very slow and short-ranged. The Renault FT was the beginning of a line of modern tanks, and the form of most tracked fighting vehicles to follow was based on its design. The FT was a smaller, 2-man vehicle with superior, though still quite thin, armor compared to the Schneider. Most importantly, its armament was mounted in a revolving turret atop the main body. Different models were produced using cannon or machine guns in the turret, and those sold to the Spanish were machine gun-equipped models. The FT was faster, longer range, and more agile than the Schneider, but this is saying very little, and the tank was still capable of little more than a walking speed. Tanks had been purchased to fight in Spain's ongoing war in its Moroccan territories against the Rif rebellion. This low-intensity war had occupied the Spanish Army of Africa throughout the early decades of the century, and by 1922 it had become a national embarrassment. The Schneiders were sent first, and they were employed more in the capacity of mobile field guns rather than proper tanks. In this role they were satisfactory, and were a useful aid to the troops of the Spanish Legion, though it must be remembered that the enemy, the Rif rebels, were poorly equipped irregular forces with little in the way of heavy weapons capable of defeating armor. The FT saw their initial Moroccan battle on March 17, 1922. Detailed to support an infantry attack, a pattern would first appear in this action that would mark the employment of Spanish tanks in the years to come. The FTs ran out far ahead of the infantry, and, cut off from their support, were forced to withdraw after some among them ran into mechanical difficulties with their propulsion system or armament. 2 were immobilized and had to be abandoned on the battlefield, and these were destroyed by the insurgents with explosives. This lack of proper coordination between infantry and armor was to bedevil the Spanish in this war and in the larger civil war to follow. The tanks would serve on in Morocco and take part in the successful and well-executed amphibious landing against the Rif stronghold at Al Husaymas Bay in September 1925. This broke the back of the rebellion and finally ended the conflict in Morocco with French assistance. After the campaign in Morocco, the tanks were sent back to Spain and put into reserve. The mechanical condition of these remaining vehicles, especially the Schneiders, was poor, and little was done to improve this over the following years. In the meantime, work was begun on a domestically produced tank at the Fábrica Nacional de Turbia, Spanish State Artillery Works, which was operated by the Spanish naval shipbuilding firm, the SECN, or Sociedad Española Construcción Naval. The first of these tanks, known as the A4, was produced while the Moroccan conflict was still ongoing in 1925. Like most tanks of the early interwar years, this was a development of the FT concept, somewhat enlarged and armed with 3 7mm machine guns. Like most Spanish projects involving advanced armaments, progress was very slow, and only 4 pre-production models had been built by 1936. Partly this was due to an abortive coup staged by disgruntled officers of the artillery branch of the Army in 1926. The armored force, organizationally part of the artillery, fell out of favor after this and would receive little funding for its projects until the advent of the conservative government led by the CETA coalition under the Republic in 1934. A few other tanks were in Spanish hands before the outbreak of the Civil War. These included a single Italian Fiat 3000A, which was a close copy of the FT, as well as 5 Landesa agricultural tractors that were converted into improvised fighting vehicles during the course of the 1934 left-wing revolt in Asturias. These were modified by the addition of an armored superstructure mounting a single 7mm Hotchkiss machine gun. In addition to tracked vehicles, the Spanish had a somewhat larger force of wheeled armored cars and trucks on hand. Small numbers of so-called protected trucks, or camiones protegidos, were produced in the 1920s to serve as escorts for supply convoys in Morocco and perform other security tasks. Production of protected trucks continued at an accelerated pace during the 1930s, many of these going to equip the various law enforcement and paramilitary organizations in the country. These trucks were usually unarmed and were protected with non-armor grade steel, capable of warding off small arms fire only. The trucks were useful only on hard paved road surfaces, as their increased weight gave them an extremely high ground pressure which made them very likely to bog down on unprepared surfaces. As a result, those in mainland Spain were intended for use in the cities. Proper armored cars were also produced in Spain, and these equipped 2 company-sized units of the army as well as the paramilitary assault guards, which was a law enforcement force established by the Second Republic, broadly comparable to modern SWAT units. These were equipped with the Bilbao Model 1932, a vehicle based on the Dodge K32 heavy truck design. The Bilbao was armed with a turret-mounted 7mm Hotchkiss machine gun and protected by light armor-grade steel. These were also built by the naval shipbuilder SECN, perhaps not surprisingly at their facility in the city of Bilbao in Vizcaya. At least 45 were built before the Civil War. When the radical elements of the army revolted in July 1936, it included 2 tank units in its order of battle. These were located in Madrid and in Zaragoza. These were known as Regimentos de Carros. First, which was based in Madrid, remained loyal to the Republic, while the second, stationed at Zaragoza, won over the rebels. This even split in tank units is not reflected in the distribution of available tanks in the country, the bulk of which remained in government hands. They kept hold of 4 of the old Schneiders, 9 FTs, the Fiat 3000A, and one of the Truby A4s, while the rebels controlled 2 of the Schneiders, 6 FTs, and 3 of the A4s. The government also retained the few Landesa tractor tanks and 41 of the Bilbao armored cars, 5 of which also ended up in rebel hands. In the initial phase of the war, many protected trucks were produced, especially in the industrial cities, as might be expected. The regions of Catalonia and Vizcaya, where these industrial cities were located, remained part of the Republic. However, they were effectively in the hands of left-wing trade union organizations in the first case, and the autonomous Basque regional government in the latter. Therefore, the trucks produced were primarily used by the anarchists and other left-wing militias and the Basques, rather than the regular units of the Spanish army that remained on the Republican side. 400 camiones protegidos were estimated to have been produced in the factories controlled by the Republican coalition in the last part of 1936 and through 1937, 165 of which were made in Catalonia. These were useful in the fighting that took place in the cities against the rebelling garrisons, and for convoy and patrol work, but little else. It can be seen from this that although the Republican side retained the lion's share of the available fighting vehicles, this did not confer a significant advantage. Aside from their very small numbers, most of the tanks left over from the Moroccan campaign of 10 years before were in dubious mechanical condition. Prevailing corruption and underfunding of the Spanish military led to a lack of spare parts, improper storage of what was procured, poorly trained maintenance staff, and a host of other similar problems. The numbers problem didn't apply so much to the armored cars and protected trucks, but these were also of limited utility, and especially in the case of the trucks, relatively low mechanical reliability. Nevertheless, contribution was not negligible. The first days of the Civil War were characterized by a large number of disconnected local actions against revolting garrison units. The intervention of even a handful or even one mediocre fighting vehicle would prove decisive against an opposition which had no answer to them. In particular, the protected trucks of the anarchist militias would play a crucial role in securing Barcelona, the metropolis of Catalonia and most important manufacturing center in the country, for the Republican cause. By far the greater number of the armored vehicles that would fight in the battles to follow would be of other than Spanish origin. As I'm sure you know, the three powers of Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union would massively intervene in the war. The fascist states would support the rebels from the earliest days. They would in fact cement the Axis alliance in the course of their mutual aid to the cause of Franco and Spanish fascism. The Soviets would support the Republic, the only one of the so-called great powers to send aid in any useful quantity to the legal, elected government of the Spanish people. So before we look at the battles in which these weapons would fight, I think it would be useful to examine in some degree of detail the tanks and armored cars that were sent to Spain. These varied widely in capability and design, and in order to understand the impact they would have in the peculiar conditions of the Spanish battlefield, familiarity with their characteristics and capabilities may be useful. We'll start with the Italians, as the kind of armored vehicles they sent to Spain seem the most likely to be unfamiliar to those not well acquainted with the Civil War or the Italian army of the interwar years. Mussolini's Italy is often described as the least of the great powers. Many casual students of the Second World War, especially those who come for their understanding from the viewpoint of English language sources, have a disparaging view of the Italian soldier and of the Italian fighting spirit. This is as unwarranted as the idea that the French lack tenacity and are prone to surrender at the drop of a hat, and depends upon a very narrow and frankly chauvinistic view of history. As in the case of France, the poor showing of the Italians in some of the more prominent battles of the Second World War was due to other factors than a lack of martial valor, which is certainly no more lacking among the Italians than would be the case in any other army. The glaring weaknesses of the Italian war machine were simply a relatively less developed industrial base and a weaker economy. As a result, less was available for investment in advanced weaponry. This translated into lower scales of supporting weapons such as artillery than would be the case in a richer nation's formations, as well as the less up-to-date models of most weapons. One of the areas in which these compromises were made were in the mechanized forces. This resulted in the design and procurement of large numbers of so-called tankettes. This is a very small type of armored vehicle, often little larger than a modern riding lawnmower. Tankettes were widely produced in interwar Europe. Contemporary theory of armored warfare had many proponents of the tankette, seeing them as a kind of modern-day cavalry. Swarms of these tiny, cheap tanks could be rapidly produced, and at a cost that would be much, much less than would be the case if larger, heavier tanks were made. To the debt-ridden nations of the 20s and early 30s, this made them an attractive option. The drawback, of course, was that these little fighting vehicles were much less well protected than a large unit would be, and could carry only relatively weak weaponry. In an analogy to the naval theory that held that a weaker power could overcome a fleet of expensive heavy ships by means of swarms of cheap torpedo boats, subs, and naval aircraft, the proponents of the tankette envisioned these small, nimble vehicles as part of a combined arms team that would overwhelm opponents armed with smaller numbers of larger, more powerful tanks. A few kinds of tankettes would be sent to fight in Spain by the Italians. Typical of these is the Carro Veloce L3/35. These are sometimes called CV-35s, the term Carro Veloce translating to fast tank, and the 35 indicating the year of the design. These vehicles were built by Fiat and Ansaldo at their plants in Turin and Genoa respectively. CV-35 was an incremental improvement over the CV-33, which in turn was an upgrade of the CV-29. This development line itself had its origin in a British tankette design, the Carden Lloyd Mark VI, a few of which the Italians imported in the last year of the 20s. These vehicles weighed a little over 3 tons, and were protected by armor with a maximum thickness of only 14 millimeters, or a bit over a half an inch. They were powered by a 43 horsepower Fiat engine, capable of driving them as fast as 25 miles per hour, or a little over 40 kilometers per hour, which is a very respectable speed for a 1920s armored vehicle, and they had good cross-country performance. The normal armament was a pair of 8mm machine guns and a twin mount firing forward, although some of those sent to Spain were equipped with a flamethrower instead. The two-man crew, consisting of a driver and a gunner/commander, sat side by side behind the main armored superstructure. Thousands of these little tanks were produced, and they were widely exported to European, South American, and Chinese armies. A number of specialized variants were produced, including radio-equipped command units, engineering vehicles, and some armed with small-caliber automatic cannon or flamethrowers. The majority sent to fight in Spain had the normal twin machine gun armament. In Italian hands, these tankettes would fight in every one of Mussolini's campaigns from the invasion of Ethiopia to the final collapse of the fascist state. The Italians also sent armored cars to fight in Spain, namely the Lancia 1ZM. This was a somewhat dated design created during the First World War. It was derived from an Ansaldo truck design and was protected by 9mm of armor. At 3.7 tons, the 1ZM was heavier than the CV-35 tankette. Its armament was identical to the standard tankettes, that is, two 8mm machine guns, in this case mounted in a turret atop the main body. Its 40 horsepower engine gave it a top speed of 60 kilometers an hour, a bit better than 35 miles an hour, though this could only be expected on a road. Its terrible off-road performance meant it saw little action in the First World War, since Italian troops were engaged mainly in rugged mountain country in that conflict. The same problem, as well as its basic lack of power, would prove a disadvantage in Spain, and the almost 20-year-old design was not conspicuously successful there. The Italians' soon-to-be Axis partners also sent tanks to Spain. These were part of the Condor Legion, and while the Luftwaffe component of this Wehrmacht contingent sent to aid Franco is well known, it's less often realized that the Legion included ground forces as well. The tanks sent to Franco's forces were two models of the Panzerkampfwagen I, or more commonly simply the Panzer I. Like the CV-35, the Panzer I was based on the Cardinal and tankette design, and so it was a small tank, weighing in at a little over 5.5 tons. It was also another two-man machine with a low-armored superstructure and armed with a pair of machine guns. These were 7.92mm MG-13s, and unlike the CV-35, these were mounted in a small turret atop the superstructure. The first model sent, the Ausführung A, or the Mark A, was powered by a 60-horsepower air-cooled Krupp engine, giving it a top speed on roads just slightly slower than that of the Italian machines, about 23 miles per hour or 37 kilometers an hour. Best speed off-road was still not bad, about 15 miles an hour or 25 kph. The thickest armor on the Panzer was still quite thin, only 13 millimeters, good for repelling fire only up to about light machine gun caliber at short range. These statistics reflect the fact that the Panzer was conceived not as a main battle unit, but as a light, fast scouting machine. Production began in 1934, and it was discovered that the tank had a number of flaws, namely a tendency to overheat and excessive pitching of the hull at high speed. These were corrected in the later Ausführung B, or Mark B, which had a longer hull, an improved suspension, and replaced the air-cooled engine with a liquid-cooled Maybach 6-cylinder. In all other meaningful ways, the Mark B was identical to the Mark A. Neither of these models were intended to fight other armored vehicles, and though the Panzers would carry armor-piercing ammunition for their MG-13s, this is of limited utility against anything that carried more armor than they themselves did. The Soviet weapons sent to Spain were among the best in the world when they arrived in the country. The Russians would send the Republicans hundreds of first-class tanks, and from the time of their arrival until the end of the war, no armored vehicles on the rebel side could approach them in the terms of their versatility and, above all, in their firepower. Two models would be sent, the T-26 and the BT-3. The most numerous and important of these was the T-26. This was based on another influential British design of the early interwar years, the Vickers 6-ton tank. This was not used in any real quantity by the British themselves, but it was widely exported. Developments of the basic Vickers concept can be seen in many types of 1930s armor, including the Italian M11-39, the American M3 Stuart, and the Polish 7TP. The Vickers was produced in three configurations. These were a so-called trench clearer variant, which featured two turrets mounting machine guns, a fire support tank with a single turret with a 47mm short-barreled gun firing high-explosive ammunition, and a tank destroyer model with a long-barreled 37mm anti-tank gun. The Russians purchased the license to build the Vickers in 1930, and began production of the twin-turreted machine gun-armed version as an infantry support weapon for the Red Army. In the same year, they also procured the production rights to the German Rheinmetall 37mm anti-tank gun. This weapon was put into production the next year as an infantry weapon, designated the 1K 37mm Model 1930. The 1K was only capable of firing armor-piercing rounds, and weak ones at that, but the design was sound. It was decided that a weapon capable of firing high-explosive shells as well, and therefore functioning as either an anti-tank weapon or as a field gun in a fire support role, was desirable, and work began on adapting the 1K. The caliber was increased to 45mm to allow for a shell with greater explosive payload, and the resulting dual-purpose weapon, called the 19K 45mm Model 1932, went into production in 1932. The following year, a vehicle-mounted version of the weapon was created, called the 20K. A turret was created to mount this weapon, and fitted to an adapter's Vickers tank, and the T-26 was created. 45mm 20K gave the tank the up-to-now unprecedented ability to engage other armored vehicles or to shell unarmored targets with the high explosive rounds. More than 100 rounds of 45mm ammunition were usually carried. Another revolutionary feature of the T-26 was the inclusion of the first coaxial machine gun in the turret, giving the tank the ability to fend off infantry and lay down suppressing cover fire. This capability to engage all types of enemy forces with an appropriate munition vastly increased the value of the T-26 on the battlefield compared to previous types of tanks, and it set the pattern for all subsequent tanks to follow. In Spain, this made it hands down the best tank on the battlefield. In other respects, the T-26 was good but unremarkable. It was a three-man machine weighing just under 10 tons. Its armored protection was better than any other tank in Spain, but still quite thin, with a maximum of only 15mm. It had a 93 horsepower four-cylinder engine, and could run at 30 kilometers per hour on the road, or 10 cross-country. Mechanically, it proved to be sound, but it was not designed for long continued intensive operations, and required specialist maintenance at relatively frequent intervals to avoid powertrain and suspension failures. The other Soviet tank sent to Spain was sent in much smaller numbers, and it was arguably a more formidable design. This was the BT-5, and it was a 12-ton machine equipped with the same turret armament as the T-26, and with slightly thinner armor. This tank, however, had a much more powerful 400 horsepower engine, and it could travel at road speeds as high as 45 miles per hour, or better than 70 kilometers an hour. This high road speed was the result of a unique feature of the tank which allowed the tracks to be disengaged and the tank to travel on its 8 large road wheels. In this wheeled vehicle mode, engine power was transmitted to the rearmost axle by chain drive, and steering was performed by pivoting the front wheels, just like on any other wheeled vehicle. The drawback to the wheeled mode, aside from the obvious reduced cross-country performance, was that the tank had to be stopped, the tracks manually removed and reinstalled, a process which took up to half an hour. In addition to tanks, the Russians sent a smaller number of armored cars to fight for the Republic. The most common of these was the FAI, a mediocre 1931 design based on a commercial automotive chassis. The FAI was a totally roadbound machine, with a 4-cylinder 42 horsepower engine and armed with a 7.62mm DT machine gun and a slab-sided turret on the roof. It was underpowered and slow. Armored protection was very thin, only 6mm at its thickest, providing protection from shell fragments and small arms up to rifle-caliber machine guns only, and it had zero underbody protection, leaving it very vulnerable to mines. A novel feature of the FAI was the use of cork-filled tires to allow the vehicle to retain mobility in the event of one or more tires being shot out. The first batch of foreign armor to arrive in Spain was Italian. This consisted of 5 CV-35s that came aboard a transport that arrived in Vigo in early August. These machines took part in the occupation of San Sebastian, but were not directly involved in combat there. 10 more CV-35s, 3 of which were equipped with flamethrowers, arrived on the 29th of September. The Italian crews of these machines were formally inducted into the Tercio de Extranjeros, or the Spanish Foreign Legion. This formation was the elite of the Spanish army and open to nationals of all countries. The men were made part of it since Italy's intervention was still covert at this stage. The subterfuge allowed the Italians to take part in combat, which they first did on the 21st of October at Naval Cañaro. In this action, the intervention of the tankettes disrupted the Republican infantry and put them to flight. In recognition of their contribution in this action, the Italian company was thereafter known as the Naval Cañaro Legionary Company. Shortly before this battle, the first Russian tanks arrived at Cartagena. The Soviet freighter Komsomol brought 50 T-26s and a smaller number of armored cars, along with 51 volunteer tank specialists as part of her cargo. The Russian contingent was under the command of Semyon Krivoshein, who held the rank of Kombrig, a Soviet rank indicating commander of brigade, equivalent to a brigadier in other services. The men were intended to serve as a training cadre, and they wasted little time in setting up a school for Spanish crews in the town of Arcana. This was the Russian plan, to provide weapons and train Spaniards to use them, rather than to fight themselves. Circumstances did not allow for this, however. In the desperate situation in Madrid, where the rebel armies were pushing into the suburbs and threatening to cut the city off from the outside, demanded immediate action. 3 battle groups were formed of the available men and vehicles and dispatched to the embattled capital. 2 of the groups were platoon size, with 6 armored cars and a similar number of T-26s. One was manned by Russians and the others by Spanish trainees. The third group, of reinforced company strength, had 15 T-26s manned by 34 Russians and 11 Spaniards. This armored company was commanded by Paul Armand, a Soviet officer with the rank of combat, or commander of battalion, roughly equivalent to major. They fought their first major action on October 29th when they supported 2 Republican infantry brigades in an attack on a village of Cesena, located on the southern outskirts of the capital. The position was held by a mixed force of rebel and Italian infantry. Armand's tanks failed to coordinate with the Spanish infantry, and when the attack went in, they ran out far ahead of the foot soldiers. 3 of the tanks hit anti-tank mines on the road into the village and were disabled in quick succession. The rest skirted a rebel field gun battery and maneuvered into the town, launching an assault on the main rebel defensive position. In the course of the firefight, one of the T-26s was put out of action by a Molotov cocktail, first recorded use of this kind of improvised weapon in the Spanish theater. Once they had pushed through the rebel defenders, the tanks continued out of town and then swung around to the east in order to get behind the rebel units and cut off the defense. Rampaging tanks overran a decimated battery of field artillery and then ran into a group of 3 Italian CV-35s. The first armor versus armor engagement clearly demonstrated the superiority of the Russian over the Italian machines. The 3 tankettes, one of which was a flamethrower model, were easily defeated by the T-26s, 2 of them being destroyed, including one which was simply bulldozed by the more powerful Soviet machine into a ditch and overturned. The losses incurred by Armand's forces were high, however. Of the 15 T-26s committed to the attack, 3 were disabled by the mines, and another 3 lost to Molotovs and direct fire from 75mm field guns. 3 Russian and 4 Spanish crewmen were killed, and another 6 wounded. Tanks claimed the destruction of 10 75mm guns, the 2 tankettes, 20 to 30 trucks, about half a dozen automobiles, 2 tank transporters, as well as the capture of 2 75mm guns. Further, their raid had badly disrupted 2 infantry battalions and 2 cavalry squadrons. Despite these apparent successes, the larger mission, which was the attack on the village, had failed. The defenders of Cesena, that the tanks had overrun, regrouped, and the unsupported infantry left behind by the armor had been unable to fight its way into the town. This was not the last time that poor coordination between infantry and armor would blunt such an attack. The Italian tankette force would continue to support the flagging rebel attempts to break into the city. For several weeks, they would fight in support of rebel infantry, taking another 4 losses, before they were withdrawn in November. The Republican armor would fight on the Madrid front for several days before being withdrawn. Krivoshein concentrated his units at Haradjwe, where they were to be formed into a mobile striking force, but the demands of the war situation made this impractical. The tank units were dispersed to reinforce threatened sectors on the various battlefields, including a return to Madrid and by some in renewed fighting there in December. The Russian tanks were joined by the remaining pre-war FTs in Republican hands, which were formed into a company under the command of another Soviet officer, D. Pagodin. The performance of Armand's tank units in the Madrid battles earned nearly universal praise, especially from the senior members of the Soviet mission in Spain. These reported to their superiors in the Kremlin that the contribution of the T-26 force, along with that of the Soviet planes sent to Spain, had been crucial to the success of the defense of the capital. The intensive fighting engaged in by the Russian tanks in these defensive battles had worn them out, however. Unlike later Soviet designs, the T-26 was not remarkably robust and had not been intended for this pace of operations, and the reliability issues were compounded by the lack of regular maintenance facilities, as well as the extra wear accumulated by machines operated by inexperienced, half-trained crewmen. The lesson was drawn from this experience that armor was not suitable, like infantry, for intensive operations over a drawn-out period. The setbacks encountered as a result of the poor coordination of tanks and infantry also drew attention to a weakness in tactical doctrine, and though many took this seriously and attempted to remedy the situation, more than a few Soviet officers simply blamed the failures on the Spanish infantry. In January 1937, Krivoshein and Armand were recalled to Moscow to make their report. A few weeks prior to this, the Italians had decided to make their intervention open, and the first regular Italian army formations were dispatched to Spain on the 13th of December. At the time, the Italians had 2 tankette companies in Spain. These were supplemented by a squadron of armored cars with 8 1ZMs in December, and 2 more CV-35 companies in January. The 4 tankette companies were organized into a battalion, and in February this was combined into a larger formation with the armored car squadron and units of motorized infantry and artillery. This was known as the Raggruppamento Rapporti Specializzati, or RRS, translated as the Specialist Unit Group. This may look like a mobile strike force at first glance, but the RRS was really more of an administrative grouping of supporting arms subordinated to the infantry that made up the bulk of the Italian army in Spain. The Italians would in fact disperse their armored units very widely among the infantry, with their armor typically deployed in company strength. The German armored force was the smallest of the 3 sent by the interventionist powers, and had been sent with the same intention as that of the Soviets, that is, as a training establishment to instruct Spanish troops in the use of the new tanks. This mission formed the bulk of the Condor Legion's ground component, codenamed Gruppe Inker, or Beekeeper. The tank element specifically was known as Panzergruppe Drone, or Drone. It was headed by Oberstleutnant Wilhelm von Thoma, who had previously been commander of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Panzer Regiment. Drona was equipped with 41 Panzer I Mark A's when it arrived in Seville in October. Another 21, accompanied by additional support personnel, would arrive shortly afterwards. Before long, the training group HQ was set up at Cubas de la Sagra. The training unit was of battalion size, composed of 3 tank companies and support units, including batteries of anti-tank guns using the 37mm Rheinmetall Pak 36. This anti-tank element would eventually grow to include 10 companies. The rebel 37th Infantry Regiment was converted to an armored formation in order to employ the German tanks. This was organized into 3 companies, each using 16 Panzer Is. The rebel units using German tanks were known as Negrillos, or the Blacks, to distinguish them from rebels using captured T-26s, who were called Russas, or the Russians. 122 tanks would eventually be sent to Spain by the Germans. These were all Panzer Is, 96 being Mark A's, 21 Mark B's, 4 command tank variants, and a training machine with no turret. In combat, nearly all of these would be used by Spanish crews, with the German tankers themselves seeing very little action. The Panzers proved very reliable, and 93 were still in running condition at the end of the Civil War. The rebel panzer units were sent to fight in the areas around Madrid starting in early November, and they were most often employed in company strength. They had their first clash with the T-26s in the University City district of the capital. In the course of the November fighting, 6 panzers were lost and 16 more damaged. The superior firepower of the Russian tanks took a toll on the German machines, and more than a dozen would be knocked out in the course of the next 2 months. The disadvantage of the panzers was severe. Even using an armor-piercing round, the panzers could only penetrate the T-26's protections at ranges less than 150 meters, while the 45mm anti-tank round fired by the T-26 was deadly from almost 10 times this range. One German response to this problem was the addition of a unit of 5 anti-tank guns to each Spanish panzer company. Von Thoma requested the dispatch of cannon-armed tanks to Spain on the 6th of December. The second wave of Soviet support arrived on November 26, 1936, when 200 tank specialists commanded by Combrig D.G. Pavlov arrived. These men allowed the Russians to organize their tanks here into the 1st Brigada Blindata, or the 1st Armor Brigade. This unit had a strength of about 60 tanks, and absorbed into its establishment the remaining elements of Krivoshin's command, which was formed into the brigade's 1st Battalion. Despite the influx of Soviet tankmen, the majority of the brigade's personnel remained Spanish. The brigade had to be sent into action before it was fully organized to support a counteroffensive carried out by the newly arrived international brigades against the rebel and Italian forces still positioned on the approaches to the capital. At the time that this attack was launched, on January 11th, the Brigada Blindata had 47 tanks. Together with the 12th and 14th Internationals, they carried out an attack on the town of Majadahonda on the northwestern outskirts of Madrid. Cooperation between armor and infantry was better in this battle than it had been in previous actions. Nevertheless, after the rebel line was broken, the tank units once again advanced too far ahead of their supporting infantry, and the breakthrough accomplished little. The German Pak 36 proved quite dangerous to the Russian tanks here, 5 of which were lost to anti-tank units in the course of the 3-day battle. The move on Majadahonda ended, and the rebels attempted to regain the initiative by beginning an offensive against the Republicans holding positions along the Jarama River in the southeast sector of the Madrid area. Pavlov's brigade was broken up into company-sized units to reinforce threatened portions of the Republican lines. As is usual in the case of this kind of dispersed employment, much of the potential of the superior Russian armor was forfeited, but the presence of even a few tanks proved a vital psychological factor in maintaining the resistance of the hard-pressed Republican infantry. Despite steadily accumulating losses, the number of Russian tanks available increased during the Jarama battles, eventually totaled 60. As the rebel attack began to falter, the troops of the Republic mounted a counteroffensive. In the latter phase of the Jarama action, the rebels had 70 tanks of all types, giving them a slight edge in numbers, but this was more than offset by the superiority of the T-26 over the machines that it was facing. The Republicans threw back the rebels and were themselves halted, and the fighting died down along the river sector. In their evaluation of the Brigada Blindata's performance herein, the Russians expressed disappointment in its role in the battle. In particular, the unexpected deadliness of the rebel anti-tank guns, which accounted for the lion's share of the 34 tank losses incurred, caused a great deal of consternation. 2 months after the conclusion of the Jarama campaign, the forces confronting one another in the vicinity of the capital were involved again in intensive operations. The Italian contingent in Spain, the so-called Corpo Truppa Volontaria, had grown to major proportions, and having scored a signal success for fascism earlier in the year by seizing the important port of Malaga on the southern coast, sought further victories. This time the fighting would take place near Guadalajara, to the northeast of Madrid. The 4 tankette companies of the RRS would take part in this battle. Republican T-26s were on hand to counter the Italians, and on the 13th of March a firefight between the two took place near the village of Trieste. This action confirmed the total dominance of the Russian machine over the Italian CV-35, 5 of which were destroyed, with 2 more damaged by the T-26s with no loss to themselves. Nonetheless, Italian anti-tank guns and other arms would claim 28 T-26s in the course of the attack, and when the Italian drive was turned back, only 9 operational tanks remained to participate in the pursuit of the retreating Italian forces. Reinforcements were already arriving from the Soviet Union, however, and during the month of March, 100 more T-26s arrived in Spain aboard the transports Cabo San Thomas and Darro. 50 more would arrive on the Cabo Palos in May, and 50 BT-5s on the Cabo San Agustin in August. These would be the last tank shipments to reach the Spaniards in 1937. The increasing numbers allowed an increase from 3 battalions to 4. It also meant that the training of Spanish tankers must be expanded, with some Spaniards being sent to the Soviet Union to attend Red Army armor schools, a practice that was also employed to train pilots to use the Russian aircraft being sent alongside the tanks. The Republican armor was reorganized in the summer of 1937 into 4 brigades. New brigades with different composition from the 1st Brigada Blindata. These new units, manned entirely by Spanish personnel, consisted of 1 tank battalion and 2 of locally produced armored cars. These new formations were therefore less mobile than the first, and would not be ready for combat until well on into 1937. While this expansion was being carried out, the next major battle of the Republican armor was to break out. In July, the 1st Brigada Blindata took part in the offensive towards Brunete, a move designed to draw rebel forces away from their concentration against the cut-off Republican territories along the northern coastal strip. The brigade had been brought up to its full strength by this time, and had on hand 129 T-26s and 43 armored cars. 2 battalions were intended to support the attacks of the Republican 5th and 18th Corps with 70 tanks and 20 armored cars. The 3rd Battalion, with 30 tanks and 10 armored cars, was to be used in a concurrent attack on objectives to the southeast of Madrid carried out by the Republican 2nd Corps. The attack began on the 6th of July, and the 18th Corps moved on the town of Villanueva de la Cañada. The T-26s supporting them were stopped by well-sighted and cleverly concealed 37mm anti-tank guns and batteries of regular field guns. 1 PaK-36 was mounted in a church steeple, and this gun's crew was credited with putting at least a dozen tanks and armored cars out of action. Multiple attacks were made on this tough defensive position, but these all failed, and the town was only taken as the result of an assault in force by the following up infantry. The 5th Corps ran into trouble as well, and neither corps succeeded in reaching their initial objectives according to schedule. Over the next few days, armor was used to support local infantry attacks on rebel positions, and these were mostly unsuccessful. The tanks held in reserve were committed, and by the 11th, Republican tank numbers were down to 38. What little momentum the attack had built up ran out, and the rebels went over to the counteroffensive, but proved equally unable to break the Republican defense, and the situation ended in stalemate. The Brunete campaign was widely publicized in the international press, and the poor performance of the Republican armor convinced some contemporary observers that the anti-tank gun had rendered tanks as vulnerable in the attack as the machine gun had made the foot soldier. Many drew the conclusion that the coming of the tank had not restored mobility to warfare as had been thought. Others cited the poor tactics used as the cause of the failure. Some among the Soviets once again placed the blame on the supposed ineptitude of their Spanish allies. Others still, more practically, pointed out the fact that sectors in which the Republican tanks had attacked had been defended by a denser concentration of anti-tank guns and artillery than had been the case in previous battles. Whatever the cause, T-26 losses, counting tanks destroyed or disabled, totaled 184 for the period ending in August 1937, or about 44% of those committed. So I think that this is a logical point at which to end this episode. Next time, we'll continue the story from the end of the initial phase of the war, in which the armored combat was concentrated around the capital, and follow it through to the end of the conflict almost 2 years later. I hope you found some of this interesting and useful. I also think the story of tank warfare in Spain is a good example of what happens when forces built around a more or less purely theoretical approach to a new and unknown form of combat are committed to the test of experience for the first time. So with that said, I'd like to say that I hope you all are coping well with your possible isolation and the pandemic stress in general. I know in my case, it makes it difficult to carry on with production when so much else is happening in the world, and I admit that this accounts for my delay in releasing this episode. These are truly interesting and unsettling times, and I suspect many of us who, like me, live in a nice, peaceful part of the first world have the not-so-pleasant feeling of living in the middle of a swiftly moving historical narrative rather than looking at it from the outside. But the study of military history has shown me that people, both collectively and at the level of the individual, are tougher, much more capable of courage than they would suspect in less challenging times. So that being said, I'll be back with part 2 of the story later this week, and until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.